Good afternoon. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to length limitations in the rules. And as a friendly reminder, I would like to remind audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law and will not be tolerated. Although wearing themed shirts while seated in the hearing room is permissible, holding up signs during the proceedings is not. Any disruptions will result in suspension of the proceedings until Capitol Police can restore order. With that, I'd like to say good afternoon and thank you to my colleagues in the panel for joining us here today for this discussion of Tibet. It is a turbulent time in international relations, particularly in the Asia-Pacific regions where security concerns dominate policy discussions daily. In this environment, some important issues are getting far too little attention, especially on the international stage, and the status of Tibet is one of these issues. It's an important moment to shine a light on the events in Tibet, especially with significant legislations on this topic pending before this committee. Tibet's exiled spiritual leader, the 14th Dalai Lama, and other Tibetan leaders in exile convened a first-of-its-kind conference in October, the 550 Forum. The objective was to establish a 5-year plan for negotiations with China on Tibet's future, or if negotiations fail, a plan for 50 more years of resistance. The context of these discussions is a period of increased uncertainty about Tibet's future. The Dalai Lama has advocated a compromise called the Middle Way, seeking autonomy within China for the people of Tibet rather than independence from China. But the Tibetan people in the world are increasingly forced to consider what will happen after the Dalai Lama's leadership. It's still unknown how the Dalai Lama will choose to determine his succession and reincarnation. But China, having kidnapped the Panchen Lama as a child in 1995 and put an imposter in his place, may attempt to appoint a fraudulent successor. A result that is seen as illegitimate or intolerable by the people of Tibet could cause a wave of protest and resistance, ushering in new heights of oppression. Human rights and personal freedoms in Tibet are already in a poor and worsening state. According to the State Department's 2016 Human Rights Report, the government of China engages in the severe repression of Tibet's unique religious, cultural, and linguistic heritage by, among other means, strictly curtailing the civil rights of the Tibetan population, including the freedoms of speech, religion, association, assembly, and movement. The authorities have used heavy-handed and violent tactics to maintain control in Tibet, especially in response to unrest, including extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial detentions, and house arrests. And Tibet remains extremely isolated. The flow of information in and out of Tibet is tightly restricted. Tibetans are prevented from obtaining passports and moving freely, and foreigners, especially journalists and officials, are frequently denied access. I hope that today the panel can provide the subcommittee with suggestions for policy Congress can pursue to push back against these abuses that we see too often coming out of China. Fortunately, there are 2 pieces of legislation pending before the subcommittee that aim to do just that, and I look forward to the hearing the witnesses and their impressions of these bills. Representatives McGovern's Reciprocal Access to Tibet's Act of 2017 would promote access to Tibetan areas by denying U.S. visas to Chinese government officials who are involved in restricting access to Tibet. Chairman Emeritus Ross Layton's HCON Resolution 89 provides comprehensive reassertion of U.S. policies towards Tibet, underscoring the importance of Tibetan Policy Act and clarifying the sense of Congress on a number of important issues relating to Tibet. In addition to these measures, I'm looking forward to hearing suggestions for other actions the subcommittee may take to advance human rights, religious freedom, and access in Tibet. Once again, I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today, for your patience while we had to go down and do our constitutional duty of voting. And without objections, the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the hearing record. And I now turn to my ranking member and friend for any remarks he may have, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding these hearings on this important issue of American policy and human rights. 10 years ago, in October of 2007, Congress awarded His Holiness the Dalai Lama the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of his outstanding contributions to peace, nonviolence, human rights, and religious understanding. Unfortunately, in the decades since, China's suppression of Tibet has continued and intensified. China has not held discussions about Tibet's status with the Dalai Lama's representatives since January 2010. In 2015, China stated that there is no prospect of granting much autonomy to Tibet. This is regrettable because for most of history, Tibet was either highly autonomous or completely independent. China has declared that it alone would make the decisions on selecting the next Dalai Lama. What an outrageous interference in religion and freedom. China has encouraged the migration of Han Chinese in Tibetan areas. China continues its political crackdown on Tibet. The State Department's 2016 report on human rights practices notes that the Chinese government engaged in severe repression of Tibet's unique religious, cultural, and linguistic heritage. China's clamped down on the flow of information into and about Tibet. It imposed restrictive regulations on religious practices, censored Buddhist literature and information, and demolished Tibetan Buddhist sites, and placed monasteries under its control, and has imprisoned Tibetan prisoners of conscience. One way in which Tibet has been illustrated for us is exemplified by Mr. Gear here, and that was the fine movie that was made. I'm concerned that Chinese control and influence over media would make creating another movie difficult or impossible. Chinese interests are strongly involved in a large proportion of the movie screens in the United States. And of course, China has this policy of only admitting a certain number of movies into China so they can punish any studio that they don't like in ways that North Korea could go well beyond anything North Korea tried to do to Sony. So to think that we allow China to exercise that kind of control while giving them free access to our markets is something Congress needs to review. China has increased its military presence in Tibet and has built roads, airfields, infrastructure that could be used to transport and support Chinese military forces repressing people in Tibet. This not only impacts the Tibetan population, but also affects India. We're trying to build a strategic relationship and partnership with India, and we've got to commend India for providing refuge to over 90,000 Tibetans, including the Dalai Lama himself, who have had to flee Chinese repression. Congress must act quickly to counter China's repressive tactics and policies toward Tibet. This is important for our own standing as leaders in world human rights. There are two bills before us this year. I would recommend that everyone on this subcommittee and on the full committee co-sponsor both of them. The Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017 and expressing the sense of Congress with respect to United States policy toward Tibet. Looking at the second bill first, H-Con Res 89, introduced by our chairman, along with myself, Ileana Ross-Layton, and Ranking Member Engel, asks the administration to make Tibet an important issue in U.S.-China relations, to fully implement the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, and to encourage China to engage in dialogue with the Dalai Lama or his representatives, leading to a negotiated agreement with respect to Tibet. The second bill is H.R. 1872, introduced by Congressman McGovern, which would deny Chinese government officials access to the United States if they are responsible for restricting American journalists and American diplomats from traveling to Tibet. In 2008, when China's military crackdown on Tibetans occurred, I'm pleased that this House voted overwhelmingly for House Resolution 1077, calling upon Chinese government to end its crackdown in Tibet and to begin substantive dialogue with the people and the leaders of Tibet. It's disheartening to see that in the 9 years since, China's suppression of Tibet has increased. A few months ago, in June, I had the pleasure of talking to Mr. Geer about Tibet. I look forward to hearing from him, Mr. Gershman, and Mr. Tethong on how Congress can support the Tibetan people at this important time, and I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Now we'll go to opening statements by members. Ms. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and very timely. China's decades-long oppression of Tibet is a constant example of the PRC's total disregard for religious freedom and human decency. Just this past weekend, another Tibetan monk set himself on fire to protest China's ongoing tyranny. China has systematically marginalized Tibet for over 50 years now, and I want to commend Mr. Geer for being a leader on this issue for such a long time, having met and heard him testify a number of times here, and thank you for sticking with it over the years. We really appreciate that. China has reneged on their commitment to allow Tibet to operate as an autonomous region and failed to guarantee its people their personal and religious freedoms. Unfortunately, China's crackdown on Tibetans has consistently increased in recent years, resulting in numerous violent clashes and the death of many innocent people. I'm deeply concerned that China's growing global assertiveness puts the future of Tibet and the Tibetan people at even greater risk. I believe that Tibet's struggle for autonomy and religious freedom could be in real jeopardy. That's why my colleagues and I must continue to demonstrate to the global community that the human rights of the Tibetan people must be respected by China. U.S. officials should implore China to do everything we possibly can to engage in meaningful and constructive dialogue with the Dalai Lama to reach a long-term solution that results in an enduring peace. So I look forward to the panel and yield back.
Thank you, sir. Next, we'll go to Ms. Ross Layton, Chairman Emeritus from Florida.
Thank you so much, Chairman Yoho, and thank you to Ranking Member. We got a private joke going here. Stop it, Ted. Sherman, for this meeting. Tibet is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, and I want to thank both you and Ranking Member Sherman for allowing me to join your subcommittee and hear from our distinguished panelists. It's been a privilege to work closely on these issues with both Carl and Richard. I like to name drop, first name basis. And I want to thank Mr. Geer for taking the time to be with us today and to wait so long while we had votes and then have to hear from us yet again. But you've been a staunch defender and advocate for a tireless worker on behalf of the Tibetan people. A little over 10 years ago, I authored a bill alongside our departed pal, Tom Lantos, and I want to thank him for his work on this, which eventually became law, that recognized His Holiness the Dalai Lama with our highest honor, the Congressional Gold Medal, showing the world that we stand with the people of Tibet in their struggle for freedom. But in the years since, Mr. Chairman, I have been increasingly worried that Tibet has been pushed to the periphery of U.S. foreign policy. Beijing's repressive policies in Tibet have only been getting worse, with additional travel restrictions against Tibetans and U.S. citizens, restrictive regulations on religious affairs, and censorship of Buddhist literature and information. We're also seeing Beijing demolish Tibetan Buddhist sites, jailing more Tibetan prisoners of conscience, and declare that Beijing, has the decision-making power over the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. Sadly, instead of supporting the people of Tibet and standing up to Beijing's policy, U.S. administration after U.S. administration have held back. being fearful of upsetting the Chinese, and this is simply unacceptable. We must stand strong in our commitment to the people of Tibet, and that is why last month I was proud to introduce House Concurrent Resolution 89 alongside Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and Steve Shabbat, and our bill outlines a path forward on U.S. policy on Tibet. And I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor this important bipartisan resolution. It details certain priorities, including pressing Beijing to enter into a dialogue with the Dalai Lama that leads to a negotiated agreement on Tibet, and it publicly calls for the immediate release of political and religious prisoners. It calls for the appointment of a special coordinator for Tibetan issues and at the State Department who would report directly to the Secretary of State. It calls for the revocation of appropriate privileges of any Chinese official responsible for impeding access of U.S. citizens to Tibet, an issue that I'm also proud to be working on as a co-sponsor of my good friend Jim McGovern in his bill, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, H.R. 1872. I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor this important legislation as well. All of the Chinese regime's actions that I mentioned are not only immoral and unjust, but they violate the Tibetan people's most basic human rights, and they are threatening the stability of a crucial area for U.S. interests. Our own U.S. national security interests dictate that we oppose China's increasingly repressive policies on Tibet, and that we work toward a negotiated solution and start making the treatment of the people of Tibet an important factor in our relations with Beijing. So thank you, Chairman Yoho. Thank you, Ranking Member Sherman, for taking the time, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your comments, and I'd like to ask if there's no objections to allow Mr. McGovern, the author of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017, say a few words. Hearing no objection, Mr. McGovern.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Yoho and Ranking Member Sherman for convening this hearing, and I want to thank my colleagues up here. And I hope the Chinese government is listening, because in a Congress where there's lots that divides Democrats and Republicans, this is an issue that brings us together. We're all speaking with one voice here today. We're all saying that Tibet is important, that human rights in Tibet is important, and that we believe our government must do more. And I think this is a particularly important time because the human rights situation in Tibet is dire and deteriorating. And I got to be honest with you, I'm frustrated that our government hasn't done more over the years. I say that not only in reference to the Trump administration. I, quite frankly, was frustrated while President Obama was in office, that while some symbolic steps were taken, in the end, Tibet's status remained the same. And so whether it was Democratic or Republican administrations, we haven't done nearly enough to raise this issue. There was no progress. There's been no progress in restarting the Tibetan-Chinese dialogue or in advancing Tibetan autonomy. Control over the practice of Buddhism tightened, and the use of the Tibetan language has become more restrictive. And too many people found the situation so unbearable that they took to the unimaginable decision to self-emulate. As things have worsened in recent years, there have been no consequences for Chinese authorities, none. All of us love and respect His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and that is as it should be. Our relationship with him and our solidarity help keep the Tibet issue in the public eye. But that is not enough. The Dalai Lama is 82 years old and he's getting tired. For that reason, he recently decided to turn over his international engagements to emissaries. I believe the Dalai Lama could play a very constructive role in negotiating a better future for the Tibetan people. But China clearly doesn't see it that way. China is waiting him out and counting on his eventual departure to remove Tibet from the international agenda. So we need to move now, and we need some leverage. And that is why earlier this year, along with a bipartisan group of members, I introduced H.R. 1872, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. As has been mentioned, this bill imposes consequences for just one aspect of China's bad behavior. It's restrictions on travel to areas in China where ethnic Tibetans live. Chinese diplomats have unrestricted access to anywhere in the United States. U.S. citizens and U.S. journalists and U.S. diplomats ought to have the same. And the current status of things, quite frankly, is unacceptable. If China wants its citizens and officials to travel freely in the United States, Americans must be able to travel freely in China, including Tibet. But allowing travel to Tibet is only one step China needs to take, and there are others. Most especially, China should permit His Holiness the Dalai Lama to return to Tibet for a visit if he so desires. He has that right, and he must have that opportunity before it is too late. On our side, we need to insist that the State Department name a special coordinator for Tibetan issues. This appointment is a statutory requirement. To make progress on Tibet issues, we need someone in charge. We in Congress should also insist that the administration make use of the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction Chinese officials responsible for torture and extrajudicial killings of Tibetans, like the revered monk Tenzin Delek Rinpoche. It's been nearly 2.5 years since he died in a Chinese prison, and still there is no accountability for his death. I say to all of you, as my colleagues, time may be running out for the Tibetan people. All those who say they believe in the rights of the Tibetans must move beyond words to concrete actions. We have been talking the talk for years. We now need to walk the walk. If human rights on Tibet really matters, then our government, the United States government, has to stop being such a cheap date when it comes to this issue. We need a bolder policy. We need to be thinking out of the box, and we need to indicate to the Chinese government that we are serious on this matter. Let us take advantage of our power. Let us create some leverage. The first step could be a markup in the passage of H.R. 1872 and the other legislation that has been mentioned here. But I'll close with this. I have always believed that if the United States stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And what is happening to the Tibetan people and to the Tibetan culture is unconscionable. And it is no longer enough for us to tell people we revere the Dalai Lama or meet him when he comes here, although that is important. Now is the time to take the next steps. I want a good relationship with China. I admire the Chinese people, but this is a serious human rights matter, and it demands more serious attention by our government. And again, I thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for convening this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you for your comments, and we'll get on with the, go ahead. We'll go on to the testimony from our esteemed panel, and I feel blessed that we have you three experts here today. Not only are you experts in the area, your passion and your persistence is so important in getting this message out to bring the spotlight on the world stage. We have with us Mr. Richard Gere. I think everybody knows or has seen his movies. Chair of the Board of Directors of International Campaign for Tibet. Mr. Tenzin Taetong, Director of Tibetan Services for Radio Free Asia. And Mr. Carl Gershman, President of the National Endowment for Democracy. And you guys have probably done this more than I have. You know, there'll be a 5-minute timer in front of you. Press your button that says talk so that the microphone is on, and then you'll see the lights go from green, yellow, and red, and we'll let you talk. And Mr. Gere, if you'd start off, thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm going to be incredibly blunt with you. I am totally knocked out by the words that I'm hearing from all of you. And I've seen this evolve over decades now, how people talk about Tibet and from what part of their being they speak. And this is coming from a deep place in all of you. I think everyone in this room is feeling this from a deep place. How important this is, maybe not strategically, but humanly. And what it means to us as Americans to be coming from this place of universal responsibility, protecting the welfare and human rights of everyone on this planet. But I really want to thank you, Chairman Yoho, for presiding over this. And Mr. Sherman, thank you very much. And of course, Ileana, we're on first name basis. And Eddie, thank you very much for pushing so hard. Jim, as always, thank you for the depth of perception and the openness of your emotions. in dealing with a subject as difficult as this. I also see over to my right, there's a painting up here of Tom Lantos. And as you know, he was chairman of this committee. He was also the convener of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. He was a great friend of mine, great friend of the Tibetan people, and a close and dear friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I think he would be so happy right now as he's looking down from there to hear these fiery, compassionate, and deeply committed words from all of you, and I thank you for that. 15 years ago, something kind of miraculous happened at the end of 2002. President Bush signed into law the Tibetan Policy Act after it received bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. This legislation dictates how U.S. policy towards Tibet should be conducted by the administration. Congress and this subcommittee have a very important role to play in monitoring that policy and how it is to be conducted. 10 years ago, on October 17, 2007, the U.S. Congress bestowed upon His Holiness our highest civilian honor here in America with the awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal. And clearly, there are people in this room who worked really hard on that to make that happen. I want to thank all of you again for having done that. There were so many wonderful people there that day, the entire government, and it was bipartisan at the highest levels. The President Bush and First Lady Laura Bush was there. Mr. Boehner was there, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, and I actually remember Mitch McConnell giving the most powerful speech that evening on human rights and on behalf of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It makes me kind of wish that people would be talking today the way they did then on how important human rights are. As Americans, as people who care. It's kind of the centerpiece of the American soul is that we do care, and we have to continually talk about these things and express them. Tibet has been an issue that has earned extraordinary support in the U.S. Congress over the decades, including humanitarian aid for the Tibetan refugee communities in India and Nepal. The congressional delegation led by Leader Pelosi and Congressman Sensenbrenner, which visited India and Nepal last May, confirmed once again the commitment of this institution to Tibet and saw firsthand the positive impact that development aid has had in these communities, and it is pretty extraordinary, something to be very proud of. Since the 1990s, subsequent U.S. administrations and presidents have supported the call of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, not for independence, but for genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people as guaranteed in the Chinese Constitution, and for China to respect the distinct identity of the Tibetan people, including their language, their religion, and their culture, and to stop the ongoing persecution of Tibetans. The respect for the identity of a people and their religion is something that the American people understand very well and deeply care about. Before being politicians or actors, we are human beings who understand that oppression cannot be tolerated. We understand that all human beings have the right to the pursuit of happiness and to avoid suffering. This is what His Holiness the Dalai Lama continuously reminds us of, to look at what unites us as human beings, as compassionate people sharing our time and space on this small and very beautiful planet, drifting through an endless universe. We're in this together, all of us. This is consistent in this message that His Holiness and our Tibetan brothers and sisters send to the Chinese government and to all of us. Despite the historical, cultural, linguistic, and ethnic differences, and despite decades of oppression, the proposal for genuine autonomy presented by the Tibetans shows a path towards peaceful coexistence and away from endless conflict. Despite these efforts, the Chinese government ceased formal talks with the representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2010, and Tibetans inside Tibet continue to live in very, very challenging times indeed. Just last week, November 26th, a 63-year-old Tibetan monk named Tenga self-immolated in Tibet. He was the 151st Tibetan to self-immolate in the land of snows since the first one in 2009. We actually have a picture of him right now. Molly, do you have that? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tanga, who just sacrificed his life for the Tibetan people, his brothers and sisters. But not just that, I think it was a message to us and perhaps our failure to engage an issue which is literally life and death for the Tibetan people and their culture. I don't know if we can put this on the record. It's up there. Okay, good. Thank you. According to our sources, the body of Tanga has not been returned to his family. Seems to be what the Chinese authorities are doing now. They either allow prisoners to die, as in Tenzin Rinpoche, and then and some are, in fact, tortured to death, and the bodies are not returned to their families. There's a collective punishment to the villages, to the families. This is clearly against international law, but is carried out every day against Tibetans by the Chinese government. As we meet today, hundreds of Tibetans are imprisoned for expressing their opinions or beliefs. Tibetan monasteries across Tibet are under strict police surveillance, with police stations actually built inside the monasteries, or sometimes just besides them. Religious regulations give the Chinese Communist Party, not Tibetan Buddhists, the authority to identify and appoint reincarnated Tibetan lamas, including the Dalai Lama. Tibetan nomads are being removed from their land and relocated in socialist villages. A number of urban centers in Tibet now have a majority of ethnic Han Chinese settlers, and the use of the Tibetan language is intensely discouraged. These are the policies that threaten the very survival of Tibetan identity. Now, just a few weeks ago, as you know, the 19th Congress of the Communist Party reaffirmed and expanded the power and role of President Xi Jinping. As China's profile obviously grows on the world stage, its accountability as to international law and norms must also grow. And the United States leadership in this area has always been essential to that accountability. And I call on this committee and our government to make sure that that accountability is robust. During President Trump's recent visit to China, the White House stated that the issue of human rights was raised with Chinese authorities. We don't have the details on that, unfortunately, what was said. While this is good, President Trump and Secretary Tillerson did not publicly highlight the lack of respect of human rights in Tibet or the need for China to restart the dialogue process with the Dalai Lama. Now, this is out of line completely with the provisions of the Tibetan Policy Act. This is now critical that the U.S. Congress takes concrete initiatives to make sure that the Tibet Policy Act, which is law, is fully implemented, and that China is consistently reminded that the U.S. stands with the Tibetan people in full support of their peaceful aspirations. Early this year, Congressman McGovern and Senator Rubio introduced legislation in the House and the Senate to put pressure on China to allow U.S. diplomats, journalists, and NGOs to have free access to Tibet based on the principle of reciprocity. U.S. citizens face severe restrictions in their access to Tibet, while Chinese citizens, diplomats, NGOs, journalists, and media have free access to the United States. By the way, I've not been allowed in mainland China since 1993. Reciprocity is an important principle in diplomatic relations that should be implemented not only when it comes to trade, but also to freedom of movement and freedom of information. To give you a few examples of the lack of reciprocity with China, the State Department reports that the officials of the government of the United States submitted 39 requests for diplomatic access to the Tibetan Autonomous Region, TAR, between May 2011 and July 2015. Only 4 were granted of the 39. And when such requests are granted, diplomatic personnel are closely supervised, given few opportunities to meet with local residents, not approved by the authorities. And those that were on the CODEL to Tibet know how monitored they were in this process. It was extremely difficult, impossible to meet anyone without supervision. In September 2016, an article in the Washington Post reported that, quote, the Tibetan Autonomous Region is harder to visit as a journalist than North Korea. Furthermore, the
Gear?
Foreign Correspondents Club of China
Gear?
reports, sorry.
Can I get you to hold your recommendation so we can get the other witnesses? And I hate to ask you that because
No,
you waited for us for
absolutely,
45
absolutely.
minutes.
No, please.
But I'll give you time during my questioning to finish that up.
Great.
Is that, you
No,
want to
that's
finish?
fine. That's perfectly fine. This is your show.
And the show must go on. Thank you for all that, though. I mean, because I want to hear the rest of that, and you've got some great recommendations I think everybody should hear. Mr. Taitong?
First of all, I would like to begin by thanking Chairman Yoho and Ranking Member Sherman for this opportunity to testify at this hearing. In consideration of time limits, I will go over only some of the main points in my written statement, which has already been submitted. As Director of the Tibetan Service at Radio Free Asia, I would like to focus my comments on the challenges we face as a news organization of getting news from the region and fulfilling our mandated mission of bringing this news to the Tibetan people. It is extremely difficult for any of our journalists to have normal access to Tibet. Nevertheless, many of them maintain various levels of contact with networks of trusted sources inside Tibet who can provide tips, leads, images, video, and confirmation of events. During President Xi Jinping's tenure, China has grown more strident in enforcing a comprehensive censorship and propaganda operation in Tibet and increased attacks on Tibetan culture by demolishing holy sites and demonizing the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Last week, as Richard has already mentioned, RFA reported the 151st self-immolation protests since 2009. It was carried out by a 63-year-old monk from Kanze who called out for freedom in Tibet before he set himself aflame. These self-immolation protests have explicitly called for greater freedom for the Tibetan people and a swift return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet. But each time such a protest takes place, authorities intensify efforts to clamp down on the sharing of information, and entire regions and prefectures can be plunged into communication darkness in the wake of such protests. Weibo and WeChat, the dominant social media platforms in China, are heavily monitored and restricted. This was especially evident in the lead up to the recent 19th Party Congress. Authorities ramped up efforts to police WeChat and warned Tibetan monastery heads about the severe consequences their entire establishments would face if monks and nuns shared or discussed content deemed sensitive. Chinese authorities also bring the heavy hand of law enforcement down on any Tibetan caught sharing information of events with foreign outlets. Authorities harass families of reporters and stringers working for Radio Free Asia, and they have even targeted Tibetans in the United States. A Tibetan American in New York, a regular listener to RFA who sends our programs out over social media, was somehow identified by Chinese security authorities. The authorities tracked down his family in Tibet, interrogating and threatening them with retribution. While Chinese journalists travel and work freely in the United States, no RFA Tibetan reporter can obtain a journalist visa to enter Tibet. Even when applying for visas to visit family, RFA reporters are subject to extensive questioning by Chinese embassy officials, while parallel inquiries are made of family members back home by local authorities. Such a process can go on indefinitely and more often than not result in a denial. 2 months ago, one of our reporters was granted permission to visit his ailing brother after weeks of pleading for a visa, and was finally able to visit and spend the last few days with his brother before he passed away. Another reporter who had not met his family members for 10 years had to rendezvous in Hong Kong because he was repeatedly denied a visa to visit home. Yet another who wanted to visit relatives in China on a 72-hour non-visa requirement transit privilege accorded to all US passport holders was denied entry because he was identified as a Tibetan. Beijing has recently redirected increased resources to build up its Tibetan language media operations on radio, online, and Tibet, which offers audiences almost solely entertainment programming punctuated by propaganda-driven news serving the CCP's narrative. All the while, they continue to try and deny access to RFA's programming on radio and online by jamming shortwave signals and blocking access to the Tibetan website. The erosion of religious and, pardon me, I have just one more paragraph. The erosion of religious rights and freedoms in Tibet may be best illustrated by the demolition and crackdown on Larungar this year. Larungar is one of the most prominent and vibrant Tibetan Buddhist learning centers with monks and nuns from all over the country. We were able to cover these developments because many of his residents sent us photos, reports, and video. Similarly, last year, local activists in eastern Tibet informed us of mining activities in a region that was causing extensive environmental damage. When the mining was finally halted, the local Tibetans informed us that it was outside attention, especially the steady reporting of RFA, which forced Chinese authorities to put an end to the mining. Trust is a two-way street for RFA with both our sources and audiences. We recently learned that a monk who was among those expelled from Larunga, he told us that he was devastated when he was expelled, but he had no regrets in reaching out to us. Such feedback reaffirms the importance of our mission. As one Tibetan listener inside China recently said, quotes, RFA broadcasts clearly about the conditions inside Tibet and where His Holiness the Dalai Lama is going to visit and what he is doing. Because they broadcast such true information, I strongly trust it, period. RFA strives to keep earning that trust and keep connecting the Tibetan people with the truth. Thank you.
Mr. Taetong, thank you, and I appreciate you talking about the RFA, how important that is. Mr. Gershman?
Thank you, Chairman Yoho, and Ranking Member Sherman, for the invitation to testify before the subcommittee. On this important matter. It's great to be here today among so many friends. I want to begin by noting an article that appeared last week in the Washington Post by David Ignatius that was provocatively entitled, China's Plan to Rule the World. The article referenced several reports commissioned by the Pentagon and the Air Force, one of which describes China's economic and military buildup as perhaps the most ambitious grand strategy undertaken by a single nation in modern times. The article describes several dimensions of the strategy, in particular the $1 trillion One Belt, One Road trade and infrastructure plan that dwarfs by some 7 times the Marshall Plan in post-war Europe, and that has the strategic intent of constructing a Chinese-led order in Eurasia. The United States and many other countries have tended to take a benign view of China's policies because Xi Jinping tries to present himself to the world as a global citizen, and he does not indulge in the brazen behavior of Russia's Vladimir Putin. In addition, the illusion still persists that the integration of China into the global economy and political order will moderate its behavior and encourage its internal liberalization. In fact, the threat posed by China to the world order has increased with its growing economic power, and repression is worse today than at any time since the death of Mao Zedong 4 decades ago. Nowhere is this repression more cruel than in Tibet, where the Chinese government is pursuing a policy that the Dalai Lama has called cultural genocide. In addition to the systematic effort to destroy the Tibetan religion, language, culture, and distinct national identity, China has flooded Tibet with Han Chinese settlers, placed monasteries under direct government control, arrested and tortured writers, and forcibly resettled more than 2 million nomads in urban areas, destroying their traditional way of life and disrupting the fragile ecosystem of the Tibet Plateau. The death and likely murder in prison in July 2015 of Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, the beloved community leader and spiritual teacher, is emblematic of this oppression, which has led to the self-immolation in desperate protest of more than 150 Tibetans. The continued Tibetan resistance to Chinese oppression exposes the falseness of China's claim to the legitimacy of its rule in Tibet, which rests on the assertion stated in a white paper issued by the Chinese government in 2015 that, quote, Tibet has been an integral part of China since antiquity. China insists that it won't resume negotiations over Tibet's status that it broke off in 2010 until the Dalai Lama agrees to this assertion, something he cannot do since it is contradicted by the historical literature and overlooks the fact that Communist China invaded Tibet and illegally annexed it in 1959. I believe that it is not sufficient just to protest against the massive violations of human rights that are taking place in Tibet. It is also necessary to state clearly that Tibet was not a part of China before the invasion occurred, that China violated international law by invading Tibet, and that it continues to violate international law by denying the Tibetan people their right to self-determination. Most of all, I think we need to take a realistic look at China's global strategy. In doing so, we need to heed the words of Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese dissident who was not allowed to attend the ceremony in Oslo when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 and who died in prison last July. More than a decade ago, Liu warned that if China continued to rise as a dictatorship, the results will not only be another catastrophe for the Chinese people, but likely also a disaster for the spread of liberal democracy in the world. We need to remember Liu Xiaobo, study his writings about the relationship between international security and political freedom, and shape a policy toward China that recognizes the dangers we face and is consistent with the values we cherish. We also need to remember that the struggle for Tibetan rights cannot be separated from the fight for human rights and freedom in China. In 2008, following the outbreak of violence in Lhasa, Liu and 28 other Chinese dissidents appealed to Chinese leaders to engage in direct dialogue with the Dalai Lama and expressed their hope that the Chinese and Tibetan people will do away with the misunderstandings between them, develop their interactions with each other, and achieve unity. That is the path to a more democratic China and to a more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I've just been informed that they're going to call votes between 4 and 4:15. And so if we can adhere to the 5 minutes, what I want to read out here is Freedom House's latest Freedom Index ranked Tibet second least free place on the planet, slightly better than Syria, but less free than North Korea. I don't know how that can happen. Yet the situation in Syria and North Korea get far more media coverage thanks to the crisis and the threats of terrorism and nuclear war. Tibetan leaders lament that their nonviolent movement is ignored while violent movements and violent regimes succeed. Tibetans are nationalists, but they are not seeking ethnic purity in Tibet like the militant Buddhist nationalists in Burma, nor are the Tibetans seeking their own state like the Kurds in Iraq. Instead, the Tibetan leadership is pursuing a middle-way approach that seeks limited autonomy within China. They just want to be left alone. And as I said, Mr. Gear, I'm going to stop there and let you finish up your talk and your recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, we have recommendations. I think look, we think that the Policy Act, the passing of bipartisan bill H.R. 1872, the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2017 is important. It's a win. It's international norms, the rule of law, which is something that's very hard to find inside of Tibet and also China. But there are norms. If they want to be the superpower they claim to be and the world leader they claim to be, these norms are to be followed, and that's part of what the Tibet Policy Act is aiming towards. But this is very specific in terms of that reciprocal access to Tibet. The Senate version of that, H-Con Resolution 89, the same. These things need to be passed, and they can be passed, and I think it's important. I think another important part of the Tibet Policy Act was to encourage the negotiations between the Dalai Lama's representatives and the Chinese government. We have not done that recently, and this needs to be at the forefront of what our policy is with China. It's not unreasonable, and it's actually good for China. To resolve this Tibetan issue is good for everyone, especially the Chinese. It's funny, every time there's a new president of the People's Republic of China, I somehow get a message to them and said, the first thing that you can do is become Times Man of the Year by coming to a conclusion with this Tibetan problem. A picture of Xi Jinping with the Dalai Lama shaking hands and coming to a conclusion costs the Chinese nothing, nothing. The Tibetan point of view is one of nonviolence and inclusion. I think another point, and I've been making this for years, is that the administration can't do this alone. The U.S. can't do it alone. We have to work with our European counterparts, and not just in Europe, but in other countries as well, in a multilateral approach. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have a State Department that's fully manned at this point, but this is the kind of thing the State Department should be spending time and energy with counterparts in our allied countries around the world. The Chinese are very good at making separate deals with every country. If we were a unified world in confronting these problems in China, we really could get somewhere. The U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues is extremely important. We have yet to have one. This has never happened. Greg Craig was the very first one in, when was it? What was the year? 91? When was it? 97 was the first time, and we've been fully employed in that job since then. We've gone a year now without having a special coordinator for Tibetan issues, which is part of the Tibet Policy Act. I think it's reasonable to expect Congress to demand that that position be filled with a quality, high-level person, as it has always been. I think the access issue is very important. I think His Holiness meeting with either the President of the United States or the Secretary, Rex Tillerson, I think is also important. I think a man-to-man meeting, an understanding of the issues, of understanding where the Tibetan people are coming from, not how they're characterized by the Communist Party, but to hear it from the Tibetans themselves, no better representative than His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. I think we have to continue our humanitarian assistance to the Tibetan communities. It's not that much money, frankly, and the millions of dollars is doing extraordinary things. We have to continue that, and we can't allow that to be taken away. Another thing we've talked about for some time is establishing a consulate in Lhasa. Completely doable, and again, part of the modern world. If people are traveling, the Chinese are traveling here, Americans want to and should be traveling to Tibet, and we should have a consulate. And I think beyond that, we should say to the Chinese, if you want a consulate in Atlanta, I think you can give us one in Lhasa.
That's right. I'm going to have to cut you off and go on to the Mr. Sherman, but what I'd like you to do is go ahead and submit those so we can put them in the record and we can review those, because I think they're very valid points.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I really appreciate it. We'll go to the ranking member, Mr. Brad Sherman, out of California.
We've got to get the truth out. I want to talk a little bit about the Voice of America and getting truthful information to the people of Tibet. But we also need to get the truth out to the American people. And as I commented in my opening statement, China has a system of restricting the number of movies that it will accept from the United States. So they've got each studio by the quotas. They can then intimidate American studios not to cover Tibet. They can even intimidate American studios not to feature actors that are concerned with Tibet. Mr. Geer, like to see you in more movies. What is China doing, and how do they use this quota system, not only to affect you, but to terrorize everyone else in the entertainment business in the United States into not being the second Richard Gere and the third Richard Gere on this issue?
I think it's a little more complicated than you're presenting it. There definitely is a quota, and the quota is controlled by the Communist Party for sure, but it's in partnership with the exhibitors in China. Now, if there is a quota, obviously the exhibitors are going to want movies that are going to make the most money. So they end up being, you know, CGI.
If there was a
movies.
movie that everyone in the world was talking about, and it was made by a studio that they had on their blacklist, they might still let it in. But when
No,
you-
highly unlikely. That's not true. If it's
They wouldn't even let it
blacklisted,
in.
is.
Even then, they might
But the
not.
power is this: is that they can say the villain is no longer going to be Chinese,
Right,
and Richard Gere is not going to play the hero. They
right.
can say that.
So you're saying the Chinese would be fine as long as you played the villain?
They might. They might.
Right.
They might. But it's
But what I'm talking
clearly
about
this
is not only,
control from the
not only
Communist
their
Party.
ability to control one movie, but they can turn to a studio that has 10 blockbusters
Yeah.
and says, well, maybe we'll let one of them in, or maybe we'll let 8 of them in. There are some other good movies for some other studios just down the street. Maybe we'll let 1 in, maybe we'll let 7 in. Do we like your studio? Will we give one studio 7 movies because they don't have Richard Gere in any of their films?
Look, I'm sure that's part of it, but I think, again, it's more complex than that. And
Yeah.
I think the more sinister part of this, and it's not only in movies, it's in everything with the Chinese. People self-edit before the Chinese even have to say anything. They're so terrified of the Chinese.
Right.
And a lot of this, in terms of the movies, is the Chinese don't have to say, don't have Richard Gere, whoever.
Yeah.
The studios themselves will self-edit that way. Now, personally, to me, it doesn't matter. I don't make those kind of movies anyhow. I make very small, dramatic films. So it's had no impact on my career, 0. But it's a complicated situation.
But
the root of it is the fear of the Communist Party ruling out your product getting into.
But there might be a Hollywood actor, big name, that does make a career in those big budget movies. And if that person was sitting next to you today, I'm not sure that it would be lost on the studio that they have to maintain a good relationship with China. I want to move on to the issue of the Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. The Chinese are jamming many of these signals. That proves to me that they're of some importance. How important are they to the Tibetan people, and what additional steps can we take, Mr. Tethong?
The Voice of America and Radio Free Asia broadcasts are a lifeline to the Tibetan people. If it were not for these broadcasts, the Tibetan people would be completely starved of any real and correct information of what's happening in their own backyard as well as in the rest of the world. We have been relatively successful in getting information out of Tibet, as I stated earlier, but there is a lot more we can do. We need to find more people who are able to communicate inside Tibet and to bring the information out. So that requires, I think, more resources, to say the least.
I want to get one more question is, China seems to be demolishing religious sites and restricting religious practice in Tibet. What can, I'll ask both Mr. Gere and Mr. Gershman, what can the United States do to push China to promote the rebuilding of destroyed Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and holy sites?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I suggested in my remarks, I think it's important to raise the ante in the way we deal with China on this issue. It's important that we raise these issues, that we protest these issues, but I think we also need more leverage in the relationship. And I believe we will get more leverage in the relationship if we raise what is the fundamental issue, which is that China's rule, its occupation, its control of Tibet is illegitimate. Tibet was an independent entity, if not an independent country, when China invaded in 1949 and 1950, and when it annexed Tibet in 1959. This is the issue China itself has raised in saying that it won't talk to the Dalai Lama until he says Tibet was part of China since antiquity. So I think
Which is just false.
well, of course, but I think it's very, very important, and it can start with the Congress if it's not going to start with the administration, to raise this point repeatedly, to put this issue on the agenda. And once you've done that, in my view, you'll get China's attention on the kind of issues you're raising. I just want to say one other point about information, which you've raised so well. The National Endowment for Democracy just today, a few hours ago, issued a report on what was called Sharp Power, which is China's information plan, information system to control, distort, manipulate the information that reaches the publics in the West, Russia as well. But it's part of the rising authoritarian influence in the world. It also is very important in our universities with these Confucius Institutes. There are over 100 in our society. They control academic freedom. They control how China is taught in the universities, and they also exist in countries all over the world, because the report focuses just on 4 countries. It could focus on many more: Poland, Slovakia, Argentina, and Peru. But it's all over the world today where they are expanding their influence in the field of information. We don't call it soft power. We call it sharp power, because the goal is to perforate, to penetrate, the way a syringe does democratic societies. Thank you.
I appreciate you, and you've brought that out very well, and we're going to come back to that. We'll next go to Mr. Scott Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, gentlemen, for your attendance today. I will tell you that I remain very frustrated with the pace of things in Tibet. And while I listened to the dialogue here today, Mr. Gere, I couldn't agree with you more. The consulate in Lhasa, it should be like the minimum standard, right? It shouldn't even be a question for us. The special coordinator for Tibetan issues, I agree completely. But I got to tell you, the communists are communist, and they've been communist as long as that's what they are, and they do what they do. Tibet is a horrifically strangled area of the world, and it has been ever since I've been. In my memory, that's all Tibet has been, which is an example of the oppression of communism. And as we sit here today, their culture is slowly but steadily being strangled away from them as they participate in it, literally, right? When you talk about the movies that they self-correct, that's their own participation in their own demise. And so while we talk about the things that we are today, it seems to me that there needs to be a new view of this, a new actions taken. The actions we have taken, asking for a special coordinator and asking for more dialogue, that's not getting the job done is the point. It's not doing it. The Chinese are playing long ball. They know that they look at things in terms of hundreds of years. We can't get past dinner tonight. So my question to you is, I wonder, and maybe because you're all obviously very involved in Tibet and what Tibet would do, and so maybe these questions are ill-founded for you, but I just wonder what your perception would be if the United States, what would China do if the United States recognized the Tibetan government in exile? Anybody?
We'd get their attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, that is it. You get their attention. Look, the Chinese, and it's been funny, for many decades, we've been talking about this. And with really smart representatives and senators and people in government, State Department, and everyone knows how the Chinese function. It's nibbling. They nibble at the edges of the world.
Consistently.
Consistently. And we back off. And every time we back off a step, they take that step. Yeah. And every area, whether it's land, whether it's law, whether it's morals, ethics, whatever it may be, if we back off, they take it. And we have to say, no, We have to recognize it for what it is, say it what it is, call it for what it is, and just tell the truth, straightforward. Now, obviously, it's difficult financially for us, economically it could be, but this is why I say we have to do with the rest of the world. The EU has to be a partner in this with us, and we have to put the energy and time it takes to create that partnership. Then we have real teeth dealing with the Chinese.
I would agree with you, and I think that this needs to be, if we believe in freedom and autonomous rule, and especially for the people of Tibet who don't get any credit for trying to be...
For nonviolence.
For their nonviolence, right? Who would be a better partner with the United States of America than the people of Tibet and the government
Well,
of
also
Tibet?
for China. Who would be a better partner for them than the real Tibetans, not the ones they pretend the Tibetans
Right.
are?
Well, they have a different view of things. They're not interested in a good partner. They're interested in control of everything around them, including Tibet. But
including their own people.
absolutely, which they intend to make Tibet, of course. So I would imagine it could just be unilateral action by this president. And while I imagine many people find fault with the president, he could tell the president of China that we're not going to have any more substantive discussions until you drop your demand that the Dalai Lama recognize that Tibet is a Chinese territory, right? He could start with that.
Right.
Unilaterally. It doesn't take an act of Congress, and he might actually get some good press for 5 minutes in a day, right? He might actually get some good press for that. But it seems to me that this Congress, and we should put a package together that includes a minimum of these things that we support, even if it's just in a resolution, a consulate, and these demands regarding the Chinese government in regard to Tibet, and move that swiftly through the House and the Senate and demand action, and demand a signature and then action on it.
God bless you. That is terrific. Thank you.
And it was China. I just want to note, it is China that is raising the issue of history.
Well, of course it is. Like Mr. Geer said, when good people are silent, that is when tyranny continues on its march. And we're busy people around the world trying to do good things and trying to do good things in our own country, but we have to recognize the small things that we can do that can make a huge difference. And to me, that is a very small ask to say to China, you're not going to revise history, we won't accept it, and there are going to be consequences to your actions. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield.
No, I appreciate you bringing that up, and very important. Now we'll next go to Mr. Jerry Connolly.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. For the record, working through the Tom Lantos Commission Defending Freedoms Project, I sort of have adopted the case of Lobsang Tsering, who is now serving 10 years in Chinese prison under the trumped-up charge of inciting self-immolation. And there's some reason to believe he may have been, his testimony may have been coerced. But what this is really all about is the expression of dissent. Certainly, I call upon the Chinese government to release Lobsang Tsering and everyone else who's a prisoner of conscience with respect to this subject, Tibet. Let me also say that, probably unlike most of my colleagues here, I went to Tibet in 1986. I led the first joint Senate and House staff DEL to Tibet. We were the first allowed in that I know of by the Chinese government. And it was a remarkable experience because what we saw was the evidence, this is 31 years ago now, of the Chinese plan to repopulate the Tibetan homeland with the Han, non-Tibetans. And there are a lot of Chinese, so not that hard to do if you can get Chinese willing to live there. We saw the destruction both from the Cultural Revolution ravages and current suppression of monasteries, of places, sacred shrines and so forth, really important to Tibetan Buddhism. We saw, certainly and heard, some low-key testimony of people who had themselves been brutalized, incarcerated, persecuted. We saw the propaganda efforts of the Chinese government in terms of a narrative about what Tibet was and had always been. This is 31 years ago. In Beijing, they insisted we meet with the Panchen Lama. That particular Panchen Lama is now dead. And I felt like I was meeting Quisling, you know, the Norwegian leader who basically did the bidding of the Nazi occupiers of Norway during World War II. I thought, I can't believe I'm hearing this alternative view of the universe and Tibetan culture and religion from somebody with your title and your prestige. And I think, frankly, I don't think Tibetans listened to him, but it was a remarkable thing nonetheless in terms of how the Chinese staged this. So everything I'm hearing 31 years later is still true. Mr. Gary, you talked about nibbling away, but they're also systematic and very patient. They just don't give up. And I guess I would just ask any and all of you, so here we are 31 years later for me. Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? How successful do you think the Chinese government is in consolidating that set of policies to their end, which is basically to make Tibet Chinese? Culturally, ethnically, politically?
As far as we know, even though the Chinese have been very successful on a superficial level, we believe that the Tibetans have not given in, so to speak. In fact, the Tibetan spirit is still very strong, and I think that's what drives people to send information out.
If I can interrupt you, so what's happened demographically? What percentage of Tibet today, population-wise, is ethnic Han?
It's difficult to get exact demographics because the actual figures are controlled, but there may be anywhere from 1 to 6 million Chinese on the Tibetan plateau, which before 1959 may have been less than 100,000.
That's right.
But most of these Chinese who come there come with special privileges. They have this ability to set up house right away without the house registration. They are given other incentives through business and government, which are denied to many Tibetans right in the local areas, including Tibetans from other parts of Tibet who are not allowed to move around. So with all that incentive, there are increasing numbers of Chinese in the urban areas. But we also know that most Chinese would prefer not to be in Tibet because the high altitude is not the best place to be.
Right.
So that's another reality that's also unfolding at the same time.
But still, a lot of people move there. If I'm allowed one final observation, Mr. Gershman. So, like the presidents of the last 2 decades, Mr. Trump's met with the Dalai Lama, right? And the United States, both in the form of the Secretary of State and the President, when they have opportunity to meet with President Xi or other senior Chinese officials, we brought up Tibet and human rights in Tibet and the situation in Tibet consistently. Have I got that right? Am I wrong?
You're wrong.
Well, Lord Almighty,
No.
help clarify, Mr.
His
Gere.
Holiness has not met with either Trump or Tillerson. And there is a question as to whether or not that will happen. I think it should happen. Of course it should happen. It's happened since the first George Bush I think it was 91, I think, when the first meeting was. Every president since then has spent serious time with His Holiness and his representatives, but it has not happened thus far.
Well, final point, because
And we don't know that
This is the
Tibet
second
has
final
been brought up.
I know, but I was actually, thank you, Mr. Gere. I wanted Mr. Gershman to just talk about the political point. So are we using our diplomatic spigots to press home this case whenever we have that opportunity with senior Chinese officials?
I don't think so. I don't, the issue may occasionally get raised in a symbolic way when meetings take place, but what really I was calling for in my brief testimony was a comprehensive, integrated policy that recognizes the full scope of the challenge. It is not just, focusing on Tibet, because it goes so much beyond that in China's global policy today. And its influence and power are expanding. You just have to look at the alarm in a country like India, or in Japan to understand how the countries in the neighborhood are viewing this. And I think we need to be in touch with our allies on this, and we need to shape a coordinated policy which should put the issue on the table and raise the issue of human rights. But as I said in my testimony, I think we have to go beyond that. And we have to look at the fundamental underlying issue, which is that the Tibet people are being denied their right to self-determination. The Dalai Lama has not, what the Dalai Lama wants with the middle way policy is genuine autonomy. He's not talking about independence. He's talking about genuine autonomy, and I think we have to get behind that and support it vigorously, and also then to raise the issue of the status of Tibet.
I thank you
For your time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your courtesy.
Yes, sir. We'll next go to the lady from Florida, Chairman
Thank you
Meredith,
so
Ms.
much. I'm no
Rossley.
lady, I'm a member of Congress. And to follow up on Mr. Connolly's remarks, I wanted to ask Mr. Connolly, when you led that staff, was that when you were a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? Because I've heard that rumor once or twice.
So I'm going to break this news to you and confirm it. I was a senior staff member of the
had
Senate
no
Foreign
idea.
Relations Committee for
Have
10 years.
never heard that.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.
Well, Mr. Gear, you had, that's a private joke we have going. You had recommended in your testimony that the United States, quote, urged the new Chinese leadership to reevaluate the stability maintenance approach applied in Tibet and the dominance of the security apparatus, end quote. I'd like to ask you for your thoughts on whether this stability maintenance approach is having the positive impact on stability that it claims.
Well, stability maintenance is the hard fist. That's basically what it is. There are no carrots associated with this at all. It's just blind and complete repression. There's no incentives for the Tibetans. It's an approach that's doomed to failure, and the only way that it could succeed is if they actually kill all the Tibetans. And they've created such a pressure cooker situation that, of course, there's a point where people feel that they have nothing to lose, and then you see these self-immolations. Now, there's very little violence against Chinese. It hasn't exploded that way. This is not a terrorist community. And the limited ability for Tibetans to express their pain and their suffering is releasing now in these self-immolations. I mean, it's one of the saddest things one could ever imagine. Monks and nuns and lay people who, out of despair and love and compassion for their own people and their own culture, this is the only cry that they can make that can possibly be heard. The tools of expression are not given to them. They've been taken away in the extreme. So this is a policy that's doomed to failure on all levels, unless it's complete genocide.
Horrific. And we've heard report after report today, Mr. Chairman, about the invasive, the restrictive, the brutal nature of the Chinese security apparatus as it attempts to erase the culture and the identity of the Tibetan people, demolishing Buddhist sites, attacking the language of Tibet. Do you think that this approach is undermining the very stability that it is attempting to institute?
Well, look, we've been positing, and I think rationally, not just emotionally, the solution to the problem is the Dalai Lama. The solution is someone who is deeply respected and honored by the Tibetan people, who is an honest broker. If they sat down with him and said, well, what's really meaningful to you? The reality is it's something they can freely give away. It's the free expression of their culture, their religion, their concern for each other as a community of like feelings and emotions and vision of possibility of the future. There's nothing negative in the Tibetan soul that would hurt the Chinese experiment. It's a fool's errand that the Chinese are on here that ultimately hurts them as well. This is a huge problem for them, Tibet. You think they want to have this hearing in the U.S. Congress? And the kind of outrage that is expressing itself around the world of the treatment of the Tibetans is not good for anyone. So it's a radical rethinking of this. But I also want to come back to what Carl was saying. Tibet is not an isolated situation. To deal with the Tibetan situation, you've got to see all of Asia, and you have to see the 100-year, the 200-year plan of China and how they will take over Siberia. They will take over the Turkestan areas. They will take over southern Europe. There's no question
The
about
long
this,
ball
that they're
game
moving.
that Mr. Perry was
They're
talking
moving in that direction, and they're moving at a quicker pace than even they realized they could.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, thanks for letting me be a part of this subcommittee today. Thank you, sir.
Always enjoy having your input and your wisdom, and I appreciate it. I want to go back to something, and I think, Mr. Gershman, you've all brought it up, and that's the aggression of China. And I think you're spot on, and we've said this before, that they're going to fail. China will fail at this because they fear freedom and liberties. But that's a universal belief all people have. They want to be self-determining. They want to be self-governing. And we're so fortunate in this country to have a system that allows that. And we need to sometimes take a pause and look at that and really embrace the freedoms we have in this country, because it doesn't take you long to go to another country to see what's happening. The encroachment on freedoms. I mean, the guy in North Korea that was trying to get out, they shoot people trying to get out of their country. And we've got people wanting to come into our country. It's backwards. And China will continue to fail until they embrace their people and empower them. Yeah, they're doing great right now, but it's not long term. With the 19th Communist Party Congress that was in China, where Xi Jinping consolidated his power, and this is almost a rhetorical question, how do you believe Xi Jinping's elevation will affect Tibet? For the better or for the worse?
There's nothing to indicate that he's a good guy. Okay.
Mr. Taitong?
From what we've seen in the last 5 years of his tenure in the first term, things have gotten worse in Tibetan areas, and restrictions have increased, and the deliberate attempt to diminish Tibetan culture and identity is very apparent. So I think it's difficult to see anything promising in the near future.
You're right, and the same thing's going on in Taiwan and in Hong Kong, and they're influencing that. I mean, even South Korea. The effect China has on Australia now is mind-boggling. Mr. Gershman, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. I think what we're seeing today around Asia, including Australia, yes, is alarm at what they see as a retreating West and an expanding China, an expanding influence of China. I just want to mention one thing in response to Congresswoman Ros-Lettinen's point about the failure of the Chinese policy. I quoted in my testimony the 29 Chinese dissidents who were calling for dialogue with the Dalai Lama, one of whom, the lead one, was Liu Xiaobo. And they said that a country that wishes to avoid partition of its territory must first avoid divisions among its nationalities, and they call for eliminating animosity that bring about national reconciliation. The more they oppress the Tibetan people, the greater the likelihood is that there will be less willingness to try to reach some kind of a compromise, more readiness to resist. And that's what we're seeing today. It's a desperate form of resistance today, but as you suggest, Mr. Chairman, authoritarian rule is never secure. And I think that we have to have patience. The Chinese have patience. We have to not only have patience and embrace freedom, we have to recognize that we do have rivals. Those rivals have plans, and we have to develop strategies to try to deal with the threats that we face in a realistic and comprehensive way, building alliances, as Richard says, because I think there are a lot of countries that are looking to us now for support and leadership on this and are very, very concerned with the international environment today.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Scott Perry, you got a second round of questions? Mr. Sherman wanted to hold off for a minute.
Well, then I will indulge him. The struggle over the next Dalai Lama, just like Hong Kong, we fully expect the Chinese to influence that to the maximum that they can. And I wonder two things. What will the Tibetan people do when they see the overt interference and a puppet, if there is there such thing as a puppet Dalai Lama, so to speak, but I mean, as horrific and just as horrific as that sounds, I'm sure that the Chinese government doesn't care. What would the people of Tibet do, and what should the United States be doing in advance of that expectation to ensure that the Chinese either decide that's not in their best interest or to dissuade them as much as possible?
Well, I think if the Chinese recognize so-called puppet Dalai Lama, it's very likely that no Tibetan will really recognize him as the Dalai Lama. The last Panchen Lama, which the Chinese recognized, he may be a decent young man, but he is finding very little open acceptance in Tibet itself. And his appearances, both among Tibetans and in China, is also very limited. I think the Chinese government realizes that. So I don't think it'll be a successful effort if they do that. As far as what we can do from the outset, I think making it very clear that it's absolutely ridiculous for a Communist Party institution to recognize a Tibetan Buddhist institution. I think just pointing out how ridiculous that is, I think is the first step in trying to prevent the Chinese from doing that.
But without the kind of the specter of the immediacy of the issue, so to speak, is anybody going to listen to that message? I hate to say it that way, but I just don't know that anybody's going to hear that without the urgency, as opposed to after the current Dalai Lama passes.
I think absolutely the U.S. government should say it's up to the Tibetan people to make this decision. I mean, it was a laughable moment that, you know, His Holiness is an 82-year-old man. He's asked who's going to be the next Dalai Lama. And he said, well, the institution is up to the Tibetan people if they want a Dalai Lama. But beyond that, if they want the Dalai Lama, I guarantee you I will not be born in a Chinese-controlled area. At which point the Communist Party said it wasn't up to the Dalai Lama to decide where he will be born next. It's up to the Communist Party. Of course, misunderstanding completely the yogic process of transference of consciousness. The U.S. government going on record as saying that it's not up to the Communist Party, it's up to the religious authorities of the Tibetan community to make that decision. And go beyond that and say of the free Tibetan community, religious community, to make those decisions.
And that would be something that we could include
Absolutely.
as Congress in
Most important.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's terrific.
Yeah, that would, to me, be simple, right? That would be simple.
Straightforward.
Should the United States limit the travel of Chinese diplomats, or at least raise the specter of limiting the travel of Chinese diplomats until we see any movement at all? I mean, I don't see any positive direction in this relationship between China and Tibet in my lifetime. I don't see any. So to me, we need some game changers here. So would that be something at least to discuss that would at a minimum slow down, for instance, China's slow and methodical strangulation of Tibet? Would it at least have them take pause, even to just bring it up?
Well, the legislation raises the issue of reciprocation. And if journalists and U.S. officials and others are not permitted to travel to Tibet, then there should be a response to that from this country. In other words, we need a single standard. We need equality in this relationship. So I think the legislation that Congressman McGovern has drafted, as I've seen it, addresses this point well.
Yeah, it would seem that most Americans and most people around the globe would agree that equal reciprocity is realistic and not beyond the realm of fairness, right? So that's-
Absolutely. And I think on your previous point, I just want to say that it's a fundamental issue of religious freedom. And it, you know, it behooves the United States.
if this not, and if not this country, who's going to stand up for that?
Everyone is going to, I mean, in this country, you must stand up for religious freedom, and we have to get other countries to stand up for this fundamental right. Because what the Chinese are now doing, when the chief official of the Communist Party says that the Dalai Lama is betraying his own faith by saying that he might not reincarnate if, you won't reincarnate if if you cannot continue the work. If they're being prevented from continuing the work, it's not for the Chinese Communist Party to make that decision. They are preventing the Dalai Lama and presumably his successor from continuing the work of the Dalai Lama. It's up to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people to make that decision, not the Chinese government. And I think we should stand up very vigorously for the principle of religious freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield.
No, I appreciate it. Now we'll go Mr. Sherman.
The idea that the Chinese Communist Party would make a theological determination offers some comic relief to what is otherwise a very serious hearing.
I once called that shameless impudence.
Mr. Geer, who is the appropriate body to identify the next Dalai Lama and to determine the existing Dalai Lama has told us where he will not be reborn, but we don't know whether he will be reborn and in which young man, or I don't know the theology, whether it be a young man or what young woman it would be.
Could be a woman.
Could be a woman.
A man. Could be have a Western body. I mean, it's whatever.
What is the group of people that will officially identify for Tibetan Buddhists?
Yeah,
Who is the next Dalai Lama?
I can only give that to you generally. I can't give you the exact people, but certainly the religious community around His Holiness, the heads of the 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, certainly the heads of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism would be intimately involved with this process.
You know, the Catholic Church has identified for the world, these are the cardinals, this is where they'll meet.
It's not.
And you're saying that it is
not as
more
organized as that.
a kind of a consensus of.
Well, it's quite possible, and it's happened before, that this Dalai Lama will give indications of who he will be next time. And that will be part of the process.
Will he identify those individuals that have the capacity to determine?
I would assume that's the case, yes.
Okay. I mean, the Catholic Church makes my job easier as a non-Catholic who has to deal with religions by this Pope will no doubt identify that these are the cardinals, and you can see how it will be easier for the United States to know who is the head of Tibetan Buddhism if the existing head of Tibetan Buddhism will tell us.
No, these
how
are
to
really
know who that
good
is.
questions, and to be honest, there are things in the works now that would clarify that exact issue, that there would be a recognized body that would present to the rest of the world. The Tibetans will know. They've always known.
And the heads of the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, are they subject to Chinese pressure?
Not outside, but certainly inside, yeah.
Well, I mean, I wonder, do they reside in
No,
Chinese?
though the heads as we know them now are in India or Nepal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Gershman, and others, what's the, I mean, you can see how China just looks at this big piece of the map of the world and says, we want to control that. But this is an area of the world that has been sparsely populated because it's very difficult to create food there in significant quantities. What are there particular parts of Tibet where China says, aha, that's where the gold mine is? Are they, what economic, Where do they, when they see economic development, where do they see it? What are they looking for?
I assume it's in the area of minerals, and where they really are destroying the ecology of the area. And the monk I mentioned in my testimony, Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, one of the things he tried to do before he was arrested 13 years before his death in 2015 was to protect the environment, because they really are destroying it, and of course uprooting the nomads. And I think this is one really, really critical issue that we have to raise. Obviously, there are very significant water resources in the Himalayas, which are also the Chinese would want to use for the development of energy purposes. So there are a lot of economic interests that they would have. But the fundamental interest is geopolitical, and it has led to what is now today.
Yeah, I mean, they're building islands in the South China Sea, not because that's where the
but
fish
also at the same time that they were doing that, there was almost before the Party Congress, during the summer and into September, there was almost a military conflict. There was a military standoff with India over the Doklam Plateau, which also involves Sikkim and Bhutan. And all of these areas are scared, and China backed off. I don't think they wanted a conflict before the Party Congress, but they're going to come back to those issues too. So they really have a very, very large geopolitical interest in maintaining that territory. And they, as I suggested, they invaded that territory. They occupy it illegally, and I think that has to be said.
I'll ask one more question. Anyone else? Is there any legitimate is there any concern in Beijing that their access to the U.S. market for all their exports could in any way be affected by their persecution of the people of Tibet?
I mean, there's no reason for them to fear it. We've rolled over.
Right.
The U.S. has rolled over. And unfortunately,
I think that answers it, and the question for us is, what do we do to change the answer to that through our policy? I'll yield back.
well, I think what we discussed before, and Mr. Perry, I think, very cleanly described the way forward. There were half a dozen clear, simple, rational things that we can do and make part of our law. And if it's immediately making the sense of the Congress, so be it. Move it into the territory of absolute law, as the Tibet Policy Act is.
Well, they've called votes and we have to go, but I want to tell you how much we really appreciate this. And what we look for, I don't like to have meetings. We like to have legislation come out of this. And we'll round up the members that were here, bring some ideas together, and you should see some positive movement. You know, I was at a conference a couple years ago, and we had a lot of the generals, retired generals, active generals of the United States, and they were saying that we are going through a tectonic shift in world powers that we have not seen since pre-World War II. And now we see the rise of China. With the 19th Congress, and Xi Jinping came out and said that the era of China has come. It's time for them to take the world stage. You know, I find that very threatening. And as you've said, we have fed this monster because we demand cheap things. And it's time to change the narrative and just say, the game's over, and we're going to invest in like-minded allies. The like-minded allies believe in liberties and freedoms, those things we talked about, the things that we hold dearly in this country. And I think you're seeing the world divide along these lines. What we know is a government that expects the people to serve a party, I don't think will be long-lasting, as you brought up. Whereas you have a government that serves the people is the way to go. And I think the good guys will win on this.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your voice and the voice of your colleagues is extremely important on this issue and on the issue of freedom fundamentally, and I want to thank you.
Well, I appreciate y'all. Have a good time.
Listen, from my side, I think this is one of the best testimonies and interactions with all of you in Congress that I've ever seen. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I think everyone else here who cares about Tibet. Thank you so much.
I want to point out, she doesn't want me to mention her, but there is, of course, a special coordinator for Tibet. My wife served in that office for several years. She continues to work at the State Department in Human Rights, so I want to give her a shout out. Thank you.